Good morning or afternoon, everybody, and TGIFF. Thank goodness it's FSMA Fridays. Welcome, and we're very excited about today's topic, the Food Defense Rule. I'm Barbara Levin. I'll be your host today. Before we begin, let me give you a couple of announcements. If you are having technical issues, we are being hosted today by WebEx, and you can call their technical support line directly at 877-509-3239. Everybody will, by close of business on Monday, receive an email where you can get a copy of the recording. If you're online, you'll be able to submit questions through the WebEx system at the end of our pre-submitted questions. And as always, for your privacy, you can see the name of your host and your presenters only, not the names of our other attendees. As always, very excited to welcome our FSMA Fridays team, and we've got Dr. David Atchison and Melanie Newman with us today. So as always, David and Melanie, welcome. And David and Melanie are coming to us live from the GFSI conference in Anaheim. David is speaking this morning, so we're going to jump right into it so we don't make you late for your session. David, welcome, and as always, we're going to start with our first question. Before we jump into food defense, what's the latest and greatest from FDA?
Well, thank you, Barbara. Pleasure to be with everybody this morning in a very wet, windy Los Angeles. I think the drought is getting fixed as we speak here.
California.
Yeah, California drought. I'm just glad it's not snow for everybody else on the East Coast. Yes, indeed. Probably the biggest update is the announcement by FDA that they've come to an agreement with the legal entities and consumer groups around deadlines. So very briefly, and we'll talk about these more as we move forward and with FSMA Fridays, but it looks like we're going to have preventive control rules for human and animal foods no later than August 30th, 2015 as the final rule. Now remember that compliance with these rules comes 12 months later. So preventive controls, August 30th, 15, which kicks us to summer 16 for implementation. Then we have a series coming out in October 2015 as finals, and that's going to be the Foreign Supply Verification Program, the Produce Standards, and the third party. That'll be August 31, 2015. And then Sanitary Transport is going to be final in March 2016. And the food defense one in 2016. So what we're about to talk about today is actually the one with the longest lead time, which is probably a good thing because I think there's some things in here that, as we'll discuss, that the FDA is asking questions about. So with the good news, bad news is that we now look like we've got set in stone final rule dates, which basically translates into we know when we're going to have to step up to the plate and have this stuff done. So things are moving. So back to you, Barbara. Thank you.
Things are moving. Thanks, David. So with that, Melanie, let's jump right to you. There has been, if you're watching the blogs, just a lot of questions about this rule. Who does it apply to? And Melanie, what's the real concern FDA is trying to address, and how have they made it risk-based?
Great questions, Barbara. I think there is just a lot of surprises with this rule, to be honest with you. The goal of the food defense rule, according to FDA, is focused on terrorism and public harm. So the goal of this rule is to look for places to put controls in place where terrorists can put bad stuff in to cause bad things to happen and to cause harm. So we're focusing on places like bulk mixers and bulk liquid tanks. So we're focusing on bigger companies and bigger brands. So this rule isn't focusing on the small guys. It's not focusing on small farms, for example, and we're not focusing on, say, tampering. So to get back to your question, Barbara, you're probably like, Melanie, answer the question. Who does the rule apply to? And the rule applies to manufacturers and processors of human food with sales over 10 million. So we're not focusing on animal food. We're not focusing on places that store and hold food unless they are storing bulk liquids. And we're not focusing on farms unless we're talking about dairy farms that are producing milk. Because again, we're going back to those bigger places of highest risk, ergo bulk liquids, where terrorists are looking to kill or hurt people or cause that greatest public impact, that single point of attack. And that's where FDA has made this risk-based. FDA felt like we really needed to focus on terrorists and mass casualties. So this rule is a single point of attack based. And that's why the small farm is not a good target unless it's dairy-based milk-producing farms. And the big brands are the point of attack here, and the big companies over 10 million.
Okay. So, David, let's go back to you, because I think, as you know, we've all discussed many times, these dates are not actually as far away as they seem when it comes to, you know, what companies have to do to get ready for compliance. So if you fall into one of these categories that Melanie just described, what do you need to do? I think people are asking about vulnerability assessments and process steps and mitigation strategies and, you know, all of the usual monitoring and verification and whatnot.
Yeah, it is this "so what have I got to do" question that obviously is on everybody's thinking about. It's like, all right, I get food defense, and Melanie's basically nicely articulated this is about mass casualty, and that's what the FDA is focused on. So what do you have to do? And there's a number of steps that the agency lays out in the proposed rule. And as I go through these, you'll see that there's a few parallels here to some other things we talked about. Number one, you assemble a food defense team. Who in the business knows about food defense? Who do you need to tap into for expertise on that? And then think about the possible agents and the process whereby an agent could be added to one of your foods in the way that Melanie described. So bulk liquids, bulk mixers. And this is getting to the point where you need to sort of be looking at it as a lens through, all right, I've got a little vial or a pot of bad agent, bad chemical. Where might I put that I'll add it to the food, i.e. a bulk liquid tank or a bulk mixer or a rework or something like that, that could wind up into large quantities of food that would subsequently be consumed and lead to a terrorist event. So we're thinking about the agents to some extent. We're thinking about where they may be added and accessibility. Where could it be added? So accessibility is an important point, because that then spins into what are my actionable steps? What are the mitigation strategies? I've identified where I've got some vulnerabilities. So as we talk through this, what are my vulnerabilities? Where are my vulnerabilities? Thinking through the lens of bulk liquids and bulk mixing, that kind of stuff. And then how do I stop that? How do I mitigate that? And you know, that can be tough. And, you know, it sort of gets into systems of limiting access and surveillance and education and training and those sorts of things. And the rule is calling for monitoring of this system and appropriate corrective actions when you see something that isn't appropriate, and verifying that that the system is doing what it's supposed to do, i.e., you know, that if you're controlling access, that the controlling access actually is working on an ongoing basis. So the system's alive, in other words. It doesn't require a validation. In other words, you don't have to validate your food defense plans, thankfully. And it does call for training. So there's sort of thinking through what are the risks, how do I control them, where are those risks, making sure that I've documented this in my food defense plan, that I'm monitoring it, I've got a corrective action, and I'm making sure people know what they're doing. So that's, in essence, what folk will need to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You know, Melanie, we're sitting here and we're using words like CAPA and monitoring and verification, and, you know, these are the same things that we've spoken about with, you know, preventive controls for human food. So, you know, it kind of feels like food safety, right? But it's different. What are the similarities and what are the differences between preventive controls for human food and food defense rules?
Great observation and great catch, Barbara. You know, as you sit here listening to David, and for those of you who've dialed into the Preventive Controls for Human Food FSMA Friday, you're probably thinking, boy, a lot of this sounds really familiar. This sounds like a food safety plan. This sounds like identifying my hazards and putting preventive controls in place and monitoring those hazards and putting corrective actions in place, right? And going around that wheel that at least we as the action group have built around developing your food safety plan. This food defense rule is very similar. So you're probably like, what's the diff? Well, there are some differences, but there are a lot of similarities. But knowing where those differences lie is very critical, I think, and very important. But also, playing on the similarities as well and not reinventing the wheel is equally as relevant. So some of the differences, just to point out, while both the preventive controls rule and the food defense rule require you, as David mentioned and pointed out, to verify your controls are working, in the food defense rule, there is no need to validate that your mitigation strategies are effective, like you do need to do in the preventive controls rule for human food, for example. And also, if you're doing your own vulnerability assessments versus outsourcing it, for example, you do need to have someone who knows what they're doing. And David mentioned all of the steps that you need to go through in order to perform your own vulnerability assessment. You do need to have someone who knows what they're doing and know how to do that. But it doesn't call for, in the codified rule, this qualified individual concept or credential, like the preventive controls rule does. And another important distinction is there's no assumption that the food that you produce is automatically adulterated if it's produced if a mitigation strategy is out of whack, like it is assumed under the preventive controls rule. And let me just explain just a bit there. Under the preventive controls rule, if you set a preventive controls parameter to control a risk that's reasonably likely to occur, and you produce food that is produced outside that preventive control is out of whack, it's out of that parameter, it's out of compliance, food's produced and goes out the door, it's automatically presumed to be adulterated unless you can prove otherwise. So the burden of proof falls on you as a manufacturer to prove out that it's not adulterated. The food defense rule does not have that high a burden on you. You're not automatically presumed to have adulterated food if your mitigation strategy on food defense is out of whack. So those are some, I think, critical distinctions that we've gleaned under this rule, Barbara.
Okay, thanks, Melanie. David, you started to mention this a little bit before when we were talking about validation, and I think, this is probably on everybody's mind. How does a company know if their approach is effective? Is this possible to gauge without, an international event or an intentional adulteration or terrorist attack on the food supply?
Yeah, it's one of those things that it is a very rare, thankfully, event. We've had a couple historically where somebody's deliberately attacked food supply for political gain or something else. But as Melanie said, there isn't a need to validate these systems, but there is a need to have them in place and show that you're monitoring them and that you, for example, if you've got a video surveillance camera in a place and you're saying this is the way we're going to control a potential access risk, then that video camera has to be working. But we don't have to, try to sneak a maybe terrorist in there and show that they can't break the seals. I think FDA recognizes, although they don't state it, is that if somebody is determined to do this, literally determined to do this, it's going to be really hard to stop them. And that's my view of this. You cannot seal a facility up to the point where this becomes impossible because you wouldn't be able to make food and nobody would be able to get in there. But they do expect us to kind of go through this due diligence process and understand where our risks are, put controls in place, and as we've been saying, track them and monitor them and make sure that they're working. So if we have controlled access, make sure those systems are working. If we have video surveillance, likewise, if we put locks on bulk tanks, make sure that they're effective and that they're not left off. So it's going to be impossible to show that it is truly effective without challenging the system, and they're not suggesting that, thankfully. this is one area where, in a variety of places in this rule, where they're asking for comment. They want comment back on this rule, which kind of just to go a little bit off on a tangent here. When this rule was put out, FDA was basically saying we're not quite sure how to position this one. We've got deliberate attack terrorism in here. We've taken economically motivated out. We're not including tampering. As Melanie said, we're excluding farms except dairy farms because of the milk challenge and the milk risk. We need comment. We need feedback from the private sector on what makes sense, what's doable, what's economically viable. So they really are asking for a lot of comment on this one. It wouldn't surprise me if the comment period on this one stretched out a little bit, especially if people start to say, hey guys, we need a bit more time to think about this. Given, as I said in my opening comments, that this rule is not going to go final until basically spring 2016. So we've got a long time on this one. This one is the one with the longest fuse. So it's a little bit of a sleeper unless you really stop to think about it. And so I certainly urge everybody listening to this, look at it, look at this one carefully, think about it, and give comment to FDA that's going to help shape this into a doable and economically feasible program.
Thank you, David. Melanie, David touched on this a little bit, right? You know, that economically motivated adulteration is not included, and I guess the question is, why wasn't it included? You know, I think if you've read some of the blogs, you know, people think that this is, you know, it's obviously intentional, and that this could be more prevalent than, you know, maybe the terrorist attacks on the food supply. What are your thoughts?
You know, David and I have had many a conversation about this one, Barbara, and I think it's surprised a lot of industry that this topic fell outside the scope of this rule. FDA kicked the topic of economically motivated adulteration over to the final preventive controls rule, and I know that Dr. David Atchison has some very distinct opinions on this particular topic, so I think I'm going to do my colleague and boss a favor and kick it over to him to chime in.
Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, you know, I have given this one a lot of thought, and I was a little surprised that they didn't include it here. I can sort of understand why they didn't, because they said this is about terrorism, as we've said. This is about trying to do a lot of harm to a lot of people. And typically, economically motivated adulteration, or EMA, it doesn't do that, although we saw a pretty bad situation with melamine, both in the United States with pets and in China with young children. So we know it can happen. What worries me about this one, and this is one where maybe the food defense rule is not a place to comment on it, but I'd comment on it anyway, because I think the FDA needs to hear. As Melanie has said, they have said, the agency has said, we're going to put this in the preventive control rule. So my read of that is back to when we're trying to look at a risk, potential risk to our food supply, and a risk reasonably likely to occur. And we look at it through an ERA, an EMA, an economically motivated adulteration lens. What does that mean? Is it fair to say that precedent has been set with using chemicals like melamine in foods where you're measuring quality by protein content? And if that's the case, then do we need to set up controls as part of our food safety plan for preventive controls to control that risk? I mean, that's an obvious example that everybody's familiar with. So if you're going to have to check for melamine, then do you need to check for every other high nitrogen containing chemical in a food where you've got lots of nitrogen, or you're measuring protein? So, but then where does the next one come? You know, we've seen a few episodes in various parts of the world of economically motivated adulteration, and so where does precedent kick in terms of it shifts from a potential to a reasonably likely to occur event? And then how do you control it? in the context of this. This could require a lot of testing for a lot of compounds in incoming ingredients with probably a pretty low hit rate and a questionable impact on humans, unless there's some combination that we haven't thought of. So I think this is going to land somewhere. And the reason I hoped it would be in food defense, because I think the bar is a little lower than that one. But as I said, it has been kicked to the preventive controls. And despite that, let's not sit and wait. Let's just be thinking about some of the challenges on this and collect comments and put comments in now on that aspect, because this one could be economically fairly significant, I think, if the scope of it isn't limited. So appreciate the opportunity, Melanie and Barbara, for expanding on that one. But thank you.
Yeah, let's take some other questions right now. I'm going to go out of full screen, and I've also put a link up there for everybody to see. I think, with the release of this proposed rule, a lot of people are scrambling to learn everything they can about food defense. There's some good information on the FDA.gov site. Also, to let everybody see, we've got some great topics coming up on FSMA Fridays moving forward. If you are registered, no need to re-register. New registrations always at FSMAFridays.com. Got some great events coming up that you can register for free at SafetyChain.com. Debbie Newsla will be back to talk about her new book, Food Safety Management Programs, Applications, and Best Practices. And we'll be having one of our How to Automate, Streamline, and Improve FSQA with Food Safety Chain Management sessions on March 27th. And, Atchison Group, as always, a great resource for you if you'd like to know more about their services or about Safety Chain for Food, our software solution. You've got the, you've got our website addresses there. So with that, let's go to this question from Robert. And I should tell everybody, if you've got a question now, just enter it into that lower box on the right-hand side, hit send, and from Robert, if a dairy farm is under $10 million, will they be exempt, or will the fact that they have a key activity type, bulk liquid storage and loading will that override the exemption as a small business?
That's a really good question. I think, to be honest with you, I'm not sure I know the definitive answer, but let me tell you what I think FDA is going with this one. There is and I'm going back in history here a little bit to 9/11. During the post 9/11 era, there was a lot of concern around bulk liquid milk, and those of you who are in that industry will remember that the push to look at pasteurization temperatures and to make it an industry requirement to put locks on tankers really took off. I mean, it was a pretty common practice, but it became almost 100% required, which is now kind of best practice, state of the art for the industry. And the reason I'm saying this is, of all the foods, this is probably the one where FDA has most concern. And it is based on some logic, it's based on analytics, it's based on some thinking and some risk assessment. So my view of that is that if they go down this road of requiring something to be done on farms for bulk milk, it will apply to every farm, I think. And I don't think the 10 million cutoff will account, because that would probably exclude a lot of farms and thus would not be mitigating a lot of potential risk, because the vulnerability assessments would tell us that if a terrorist was to add a bad agent in a relatively small amount of milk on a farm, they could add enough that despite dilution in a milk tanker, say it goes from 500, 300 gallons to 5,000 in a milk tanker, and then that milk tanker is dumped into a large storage tank, 60,000, say, gallons. You could still put enough of a bad agent in the milk of the farm that would have consequences down the road once that 60,000 gallons was pasteurized and was was served in gallon jugs to people. So it's a long-winded answer, but hopefully it's a bit of background. And this is an area where I would encourage comment if you're in the dairy space, because my read of it is that they won't use the 10 million cutoff, but I don't think they specifically said that. But farms are definitely, for milk, are our area of focus.
Dan is asking if the rule applies to retail establishments. Melanie, do you want to take that one?
Yes, and actually, sorry about that. No, actually, the rule would not apply to retail establishments.
Okay. And David, Becky is saying the food defense rule has suggested some alcoholic beverage producers are exempt, but they don't seem to define this exemption as they did for the preventive control rules. Do you have any insight on this for wineries?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I believe they are exempt. You know, the alcoholic beverages have been pretty much exempt across the board in everything to do with FSMA, from my recollection of all the preventive control rules and so on and so forth. And I think they're exempt from this one too, which makes you sort of think of the logic, because clearly wineries are all about bulk liquids. But I believe they're exempt. If that's kind of the drift of the question.
Okay. We've gotten several questions here. I see one from Bill. Also, Brian are mentioning the Food Defense Plan Builder tool that's been provided by FDA. Can these tools be used to build your food defense plan, and then who validates them to see if they're appropriate?
Yeah, no, those tools are actually very good. When I was at the FDA, we built out a carve a shop program because that's what we were all using. And it was clunky, it was complicated, it wasn't easy to use by any means. And FDA has done a nice job in developing, I think, readily understandable software that helps people work their way through this. And the food safety, that one that you just mentioned, that tool, the Food Defense Builder, is that's a really good one. We've used it, we've run through it with some companies, and it's nice, it's easy to use. So they've said you don't need to validate, which we talked about. As Melanie mentioned, if you are doing this vulnerability yourself, the agencies basically said you need somebody involved with that who knows what they're doing. They kind of steered away from the qualified individual words, which popped up many times. But to me, this is saying somebody in the team needs to know one end of a food defense system from another. So I think that this is, the intent is that companies can use these tools, otherwise why build them? And then it leaves a little bit of a gray zone as to, well, does this mean we've done it right? And I think that I think that's a question. I'm not sure that the agency's been real clear on that, except they've said you don't need to validate, but they have sort of said make sure that somebody who's working on this who knows what they're doing, without really defining what that means. So another gray zone, opportunity for comment.
There you go. We have quite a few additional questions, and folks, as we mentioned at the beginning, David is speaking in just a few minutes here at the GFSI conference, and so we'll take one more question, and I think that given the length of time that we've got for comment, I don't think this will be the last time that we are discussing food defense at FSMA Friday, but let's end with a question that Sherelle is asking. Where can our participants find an all-inclusive list of possible agents that they need to be concerned with? Is that out yet? Is that somewhere?
Oh, geez, what a great question. You know, the FDA guide to attacking the food supply is not online. You know, what's the chemical du jour that you should use? You know, this is a real fine line between providing a roadmap and expecting us to figure it out. And I don't think such a list exists. At least not in the public domain. I can tell you FDA has those lists for sure. Of course they do. but they're not out there in the public domain. So I don't think a list exists there. And even though the agency has said, think about agents, I wouldn't overstress on that. I think, you know, the assumption is, think about your system. Look at your bulk tanks. Look at your big mixers, and look at the access to those, and who has access to those, and focus that way rather than worrying too much about the agents. As Barbara said, we've got time on this. There will be guidance documents, and the tools that FDA has put together really don't get too heavily into agents. So even though they've mentioned it, don't focus on it. Just focus on this bigger picture piece of where are those access points in my system, rather than worrying about what somebody might actually add at that point.
Well, with that, we are going to thank everybody for joining us today. We will, I'm sure, be having Food Defense Part 2 and probably part for FSMA Fridays. David, have a great session. Good luck with your talk that I know that you need to run with. Melanie, as always, thank you. And we hope to see everybody in March, where we are going to be discussing the recently proposed sanitary transport rule. So everybody, TGIFF, and have a great day and a great weekend.